Okay, so now we've machined our sleeves, and the next stage is to baste the hind arm together and continue from there. Now there are two ways, I mean there are multiple ways you can do this. I'm going to show you two ways, and before I'll go into that, I'll just very quickly explain to you what I didn't explain in the previous video, which is, in case you don't know, why is there at the bottom of the sleeve this weird shape, right? And you may expect the sleeve to just go all the way down following this curve. Now the reason for this is I didn't mark stitch the undersleeve, but I will make a chalk line so that you can have a look. So we have this cuff line here, and that is basically on an angle. Sometimes the angle is severe, sometimes it's straight, but there is some angle there, okay? Now what happens is, if I would use this fancy ruler and draw a line like so, and transfer the same line to the bottom, which is basically the undersleeve, and also to the inside. Let's do that as well. What you'll notice is that if I open this up, I have a line that is kind of like concave now because of that angle of the sleeve. And as I've explained, just like the same principle that we have here, when you have a concave line and you want to fold that concave line back on itself, and you still want the edge of the folded line to remain concave, you need some extra length in here. And so, I mean, we're not going to stretch this, although we could, but what we do is instead is when we are striking out the sleeve, we mirror this angle from the hemline towards the bottom, this kind of like hem inlay. And so what you get is a mirrored image from this center line, okay? You would do the same on the undersleeve, but because the top sleeve gets stretched and then it doesn't match exactly with the undersleeve, and then you basically draw this angle that I just drew based on the angle of the top sleeve, you might as well follow the top sleeve line and then allow that to kind of like move however it wants to move or has to move, because you can't really calculate exactly what the shape is going to be after you've stretched it out. Some fabrics stretch more, some fabrics stretch less. So what I would do is I would just cut this away like so, and as I mentioned, if we would want to fold this over itself like so and maintain that concave line, we have a little bit of extra opening here. It's as if you've opened it out, because obviously if you angle this outwards, it means you're giving it more fabric, and more fabric equals length here. You can see it's like I can raise this up because there is more fabric. It's not flat, there's more fabric here, and so folding this over will allow this to just sit freely. So that's the explanation. I will go into this once we get to make the sleeves up one more time, but I just thought I'll do this so that you don't think, what the hell is this idiot doing? So the first thing we have to do is to press our seam allowance open. And what we do to press our seam allowance open is very simple. There is this idea, I think most tailors will teach you that, you know, first you have to get the undersleeve, and then, you know, you would align the surplus there, and then you would kind of like go into these surpluses because that's going to give it a lot of shape, and then you kind of like don't do exactly the same on the undersleeve, but you just smooth the rest out. To be honest, all that does is you're just smoothing out your seam. You're not really putting anything into shape anymore after the stage of machining, because the stretching before the machining has done all the work. All you're doing is just pressing your seam allowance open and smoothing things out. At this stage, I'm not shaping anything. So all I do is I'll just position the undersleeve so that the top sleeve is away from me. and then along the grain, the straight grain, the length grain, just do this. Hold it, like you can follow one grain from one end to the other, give it a tug, move this around, clear from the center towards the upper end and the lower end, okay? Then just position this so that you don't end up with pleats. If everything is to the center, you're going to create pleats. So just distribute this surplus that you have and then gently start pressing. And as you're pressing, just keep the seam allowance open and look at this area and just make sure that you're not creating any pleats or creases, because you then have to smooth it out and it's just going to take more time. Just be careful not to create them. Move your iron a little bit backwards, just away from those areas. And then once you've done the pressing of your seam allowance, what you are going to do is just go a little bit into these areas, into these ripples. You don't need to go very far. Some people will say go in halfway or 1/3 or whatsoever. You really don't need to do that. It's just a matter of smoothing this out. So then once you've done that, what you can do is straighten this out, bring everything here, so clear from the center, and then just do exactly the same here. You don't even need to go into the seam allowance. I mean, feel free to do so if you want, but you really don't need to do that. All you're doing is just making sure that this area is smooth. So we have a little bit of inlay here, so let me just trim this away. Okay, now we now have to position the hind arms together and then baste them. And what you do is right side to right side, obviously. This is the wrong side because you can see the seam allowance. And you need to have the undersleeve right side up so that you're looking at the hind arm, okay? And then you will bring and place the top sleeve on top of the undersleeve. And what you're going to do is you're going to try to align this hind arm to this hind arm and this hind arm to this, basically your hind arms together, match them together, okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to hold your top sleeve like so, and you're going to go left, right, as you're positioning and finding your way, like this, and a bit like that. You know, don't do anything like that. Don't drag the sleeve one side and then you get all these weird drags. What you need to do is to position the sleeve so that it's as if it's rolling naturally like so. But obviously you still need to match the hind arm. Sometimes you can just do a little bit of clearing and then make sure that the top, bottom and hind arm are matching. Once you've positioned it and the roll seems to be happy and free of any distortions, you can ever so slightly adjust the position of these mark stitches, and be careful because linen tends to move in a weird manner. If you have a different fabric, you know, it may all move together, but some fabrics don't. Okay, so then we do this. See, and most of your mark stitches should match. There is a possibility that some of your mark stitches may be off, but if your sleeve is cut correctly, it should be fine. Now, we have this chest line, and that's not there for nothing. Ideally, when you're drafting the sleeve, which I will show you how to do further down the line, you will have to make sure that when you're drafting the sleeve, you're already counting for the distortion of the forearm on the top sleeve. So through a process of pinning the paper pattern and placing it as if I'm doing just what I'm doing now, you would do this on pattern, on the paper pattern, except for on the paper pattern you can't really stretch obviously your paper, but you can kind of like get very close. And then if everything is done correctly, your chest line on the undersleeve should match the chest line on the top sleeve. Now you can imagine how extremely helpful this is when you're working with checks, because if you have matched and cut out your top sleeve correctly to the front panel, and your back panel and all of that follows nicely through, your undersleeve will also match to the checks at the back. Sometimes you will see jackets that, you know, the front is matching, the front two checks are matching, but the back is completely off. It's not really a nice thing. A little bit of consideration will prevent any dodginess from happening. So it seems to me that this is now matching very nicely, and the hind arm is matching. There is a possibility that because of the distortion, even though you've done really your best, when you're trying to match your chest lines, you get like a drag, or, you know, this doesn't match up. My best advice would be, in that case, if it's a plain cloth, don't mess around with this too much, because you're, you know, if you're a quarter off there, I have nothing to say. You're going to drive yourself mad. But if it is a check, you damn have to make sure that that thing is going to match. So that's where you have to be fussy. Now, if your hind arm is matching and your chest line is matching, okay, and this roll here is not like this or like this, then what you need to do is another important thing. Sorry, I have to just align this one more time. Then what you need to do is to just lift this up, flip this over, okay, and have a look to see whether your seam line, your sewing line, is actually parallel to the edge of this roll. Sometimes what happens is that the sleeves are cut in such weird ways that, you know, once you match the hind arms, even if the chest line is matching, your roll is like this. You have like 2 inches here from sewing line to the edge of the top sleeve, and here you only have like ½ an inch, or, you know, the other way around. It's like, you know, the sleeve is like this. You have this big roll here and there's nothing there, and the seam kind of like goes forward. This is very important, because obviously what you want, I mean, the theory goes that this should be 3/4. I tend to agree with that theory, because first of all, who am I to disagree with it? But second, if you have any more than 3/4, so what I mean exactly is from the sewing line to the edge of that should be 3/4. That's exactly 3/4. And that is 3/4, that is 3/4. If it's more, you know, this curve is not going to curve nicely. This roll is not going to roll nicely. And it's going to break, you know. You can imagine, like, look, if I do this and I bring this further in, you can see that now the sleeve has become straighter, and it's struggling to kind of like lay in this nice curve. So what we do is we make sure that 3/4, not less. I mean, if you do less, you get more curved. You get a sleeve that is more curved, but then you're seeing the seam right on the forearm. So that's why we kind of like match this to fall on a 3/4 distance. Everything seems to be fine. Now we're going to baste the hind arms. Very simple. Make sure they match. And all we're going to do is to baste 1 centimeter or 3/8, which is basically a seam away from this hind arm mark stitching. So that's going to be here somewhere. Okay. Now feel free to mark this with chalk, but I would want to encourage you to just learn to sew without marking any lines, to train your eye and to also be more efficient. Obviously what I'm going to do is I can start here, but I'm going to start a little bit higher just to cover the inlay of the top sleeve, because that's going to be easier for me to deal with later on. And so make a knot, back tack, and off you go. Now, you don't need to really stitch too small. I mean, feel free to do so if you want. I would say a distance of about 1 inch, 3/4, or even 1/2 inch if you want to go smaller, should be sufficient, because we're also going to do a top stitch once we have turned the sleeve inside out to add a little bit more security. Security sounds so serious. To add more security. To add more firearms. So once we've done that, I'm just going to thread my needle again. Then what we do, again, I'll make a knot. Turn the sleeve inside out, going from the top of the sleeve, and then gently, carefully turn the sleeve inside out. And now what we need to do is the following. We have inlay on the inside here, right? That's the inlay on both of the hind arms. We're looking at our sleeve now. We're looking at the top sleeve, okay? This area is going to open up because that's the vent of the sleeve, okay? When this opens up, the inlay of your undersleeve should be folded inwards like this, okay? So if I would open this up, you would see the inlay of the undersleeve laying there. Which means that if we are going to baste this hind arm, all the inlay that is inside our hind arm, inside our sleeve, should be facing the top sleeve. So when we are basting, we are going through this layer, the inlay of the top sleeve, the inlay of the undersleeve, and that would be that. We're not going to go through the last layer. Okay, so all the layers will be stitched to the top sleeve, except for the bottom layer. You can do this two ways. You can either put this on a sleeve board, or what you can do, and that's something I do very often because it's a lot easier, is I will put the ruler into the undersleeve so that the inlay of the undersleeve, the inlay of the top sleeve and the top sleeve are sitting on top of the ruler, and at the bottom we have just the undersleeve. So like this, okay? And then what you can do is you can just spread this kind of like out and then baste just like 1/8 away from your previous sewing line, like that. And as you're going through the layers, you're catching the top sleeve, the inlay of the top sleeve, the inlay, and the inlay of the undersleeve, not the undersleeve itself, okay? Here we can see this chest line is continuing nicely into the undersleeve, from the top sleeve into the undersleeve. And if you've noticed, I'm doing this basting slightly smaller, but you can also do it the other way around. You can do the first line with a small basting and the second one slightly larger. I think it's better to have the second one smaller, because if this is the outer layer, so this is exposed and it can catch, you know, a pin or whatever, the buttons of your shirt, and so it's better to have them smaller. If they're too big, they're going to catch. So as you kind of like move forward, you can move the ruler downwards as well. So if you look at this, you'll see this curve now. This is kind of like rolling nicely, and if I would just bring the hind arm edge to edge like that. The majority of this roll is pretty much the same. I mean, here it's 3/4, here it's like 3/4, here's just like a 1/16 smaller than 3/4, here is 3/4, it's 3/4. So now we're gonna have to do this. Very simple. Again, you can do this on the sleeve board. I'm gonna do the other one on the sleeve board, but all you need to do for now, if there is a mark stitch, you can go with the mark stitch, but there is an alternative thing that you can do, and that is, if you have a measure for the sleeve, you place your tape measure a seam away from this mark stitch, measure straight down. Let's say your sleeve measure is like 26 and a quarter. You go in the middle of the cuff, from here to there, and then you mark that, kind of like, if it's lower than the mark stitch, you keep the same angle as the mark stitch, but you just mark the measure, and that's your chalk line. I'm just going to go with the mark stitch for now, because we're not fussing about sleeve lengths. So, line here, carefully fold this up, make sure it's tightly against the ruler, draw a line. I don't recommend doing this if you want to be very accurate, but this is pretty accurate, but not the most accurate. So for now, this is not really going to do anything bad for us. So it's effective and efficient. And what we want to do is to put a fitting together to make sure that the garment is kind of like balanced correctly, so that I can show you all the different things that I want to show you. And that is that. I mean, you can test. If we put a pin through this line, it does end up more or less in the middle of this chalk line. But because this chalk line is so thick, you know, normally I'd like to work with very thin chalk lines. So I wouldn't recommend this method if you want to be very precise, because now this is like on the left side of the chalk line, and there it was in the middle. So it's like, where exactly are we? But for a sleeve hem, that is not going to create any problem. So then what you do is, you see these inlays, 1, 2, and then that's the top sleeve, right? So we grab everything, and everything is folded towards the top sleeve, like so, okay? Everything is towards the top sleeve. And then I place my hand in there, pinch this, and then just push it in, and I get to do the same on here. Just push it in there like that. And so that is it, okay? But let's just do it a little bit careful. Let's make sure that nothing is kind of like folded in a weird way, and everything is just laying flat, without tension, without a crease, nice and clean, like so, okay? And since this area always gets creased, and you'll see that once we get to finish the sleeves, you can just give this a little bit of a heat and weight just to crease this to make it resemble a sleeve. Now, again, if you want, you can mark, make sure you know where your inlay is. The inlay is roughly around here. I'm going to mark a little bit lower, like so, and like so. And then you can either do a padding stitch going like that, or you can just do a running stitch, whichever you fancy, my friend. So. And again, you want to be effective with what you're basting together. If I would do this on the sleeve board, and you'll see, I'll do it in a second, it's going to have to, you know, require me to take out the sleeve board, and it's going to require me to kind of like flip this again inside out, put this on the sleeve board and baste it together. Whereas really all I'm trying to do is to fold this, make sure that it's on the line. As long as it's on the line, and you know, it's not like off like this or like that, then you're as accurate as you need to be. If you are finishing a real sleeve and you have to be very specific, then I would say definitely do whatever it takes. So that's that. Now, most tailors or tailoring books or kind of like people who sew don't leave inlay on the top sleeve because it's very difficult to work with when you're basting in the sleeve. By the way, you can always press this a little bit. You can press this really well. I'm just to get like a very nice sharp crease. So don't forget that. But here's the thing. I leave inlay because I think I should leave inlay, because when I get to recut the sleeves, if I don't have inlay, it means that I need to shift the pattern down to change the shape of the top sleeve. But why do that if I can just leave a little bit there, and instead of shifting the pattern down, I can just locally change the run and be happy. All I need to do is to know how to handle this when I'm putting the sleeve in. And that would be good for you to practice as well. Now, we need to connect the top sleeve, this line, into the line of the top sleeve, basically the sleeve run from the top sleeve into the undersleeve, and do the same here. Now it's already connected well. What I usually like to do is to draw a chalk line so that I also fill in the between areas. And then when I get to here, make sure you lay this flat, like so you really can see exactly where your run is going. Don't try to do it like this, because you can't really connect something nicely. You have to see both sides evenly. So, that, careful. And again, you can do this freehand, or you can use a pattern, a template, whatsoever. As long as you can make a nice run that is not wobbly, then you're good. So again, following through. And that's it. Oh, you know when people do this, when they're marking a chalk line, then they go like this, give this an artistic flair. Then what you can do is two things. You can either just do like a running stitch, or you can fold this in to that edge and just baste this down. Okay, now I would recommend just do a running stitch, because if you baste that down, this area, which I tend to change sometimes, doesn't really want to fold, because it's such a cute concave line that you really have to stretch the hell out of this to be able to kind of like fold this without damaging or distorting the whole thing. So I just normally put like a running stitch. But if you have very little inlay here, you can just like fold this along that line, like so, and then just do like a baste to hold this down, okay? Yeah, why not? So, needle. So I will start from here. And this is a running stitch that it's better if you do this like a small running stitch, maybe like a quarter distance, 5 millimeters, something like that. And the main thing is that your line has harmony. Sometimes your fabric may be distorted so that one mark stitch, if you would connect them, it would create a weird line. The main thing is just to have a nice fluent line from one mark stitch to the other. Now when you get to this transition on the hind arm, obviously everything is folded towards the top sleeve, as you remember. Make sure that you go through all these layers so that when you're putting the sleeve in, you can actually see the run as well, because now it's hidden underneath this. But you really want to connect this so that you can see the line just going through from one panel to the other. Also, if for whatever reason, for distortions purposes and whatever, your top sleeve run doesn't flow nicely into the undersleeve, and the undersleeve is like a little bit lower or a little bit higher, don't be alarmed unless it's like very severe. But if it is a little bit off, let's say a quarter or like 3/8, maybe even half an inch, and you want to connect them, use the top sleeve run to flow into the undersleeve and not the undersleeve into the top sleeve. Why? Because if it's the case that your undersleeve ends up lower and you follow that into the top sleeve, you are making your top sleeve smaller and you're going to cause many problems for yourself, and the other way around, you're going to make it bigger and again you're creating problems. But if you are following the top sleeve, the chance that you're creating a lot of big problems is very, very low, because the undersleeve is, well, this, at this point, is at the transitional point, and so your change of line does not impact it as much as to create a top sleeve that is pulling or is collapsing. And if it still is distorted, then you need to fix the pattern. But you have some tolerance there. Now I am not pulling this together, like I'm not doing this to create shape in the sleeve. Although you can do that with a machine stitch. I would advise a machine stitch if you want to do that, but it's actually quite nice to do that sometimes. But you know, what you need to do then is to distribute all this gathering that you're doing very evenly, know exactly where you should have all the gathers, and mix and match the same, you know, measure with your armhole, and then put the sleeve in. But it can help a lot sometimes. And that's that. So that's one sleeve done. Double check. So our chest line is matching, our forearm seam is, you know, evenly parallel, following a parallel line with the edge of the top sleeve roll, and we've done the bottom and we've done the hind arm and we've just made the mark. So now if you look on the inside, you can see this basting that I've done follows into there. So when I'm putting the sleeve in, I can actually follow this line. So that's one of them. The other one, I'm just going to go through this quickly without talking so I can get to the sleeve board stage. Okay, so now we're going to do exactly the same, but now this time, instead of putting a ruler in there, I'm going to take out the sleeve board and put this into the sleeve board and then continue. So now remember, we're doing exactly the same. All your inlays, the top sleeve and the undersleeve inlay, should be facing the top sleeve, and so when you're putting this in, make sure that when you're basting, you're going through the top sleeve inlay, and undersleeve inlay. Okay? You will obviously need a thinner sleeve board for this, but if you don't have a sleeve board, or it's not thin enough or narrow enough, then you can use your ruler. So one thing that I do like about using a sleeve board in this particular case is you can immediately press this nice and flat once you're finished. Whereas with the other one, you can also do it, but then you either have to put it on the sleeve board, or you have to kind of like, you know, press it double like this, and that's different effect, not so nice, but if it works, it works. So now I can just quickly press this. Do exactly the same as we did before. Hold it so that all the inlays are towards the top sleeve. Put your finger in there and then pinch on the line that you're going to fold. Do the same on this side. Fold it in. So make sure you're right on the line that you want to fold it on, and that everything is laying flat, like so. You can even press this. Then again, what you can do is, you know, mark a line, use the sleeve board, and the same thing goes for here. If you know your forearm is off on the line, again follow the top sleeve into the undersleeve. Imagine that you want to fold your inlay down. What you then have to do is to stretch this area. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen, but I will try. You're not going to stretch the inlay here. I mean, this is on the bias. You don't really need to do anything there. But it's mainly this bottom part of the curve. And so, and don't go beyond your mark stitching, just only the inlay. And very careful, because you can rip the fabric, especially if it's a delicate fabric like a flannel, cashmere, or anything of the kind. Now you will never be able to stretch that part so much until this can just like nicely fold down, but it depends on the size of the inlay. I mean, this is about 1 inch, so it's fine. You don't want to have nothing there, because again, similar to the top sleeve, if you need to make any changes, you don't want to be shifting your pattern down. So then what I usually do is I will start from where the inlay is of the undersleeve, fold on this curve, and then go through all of the layers like so. And I'm very close to the edge, about 1/8, you know, not more than a good 1/8, which is just about 5 millimeters. Small stitching is required, obviously, because you want this to be held down. But it's important that you stay very close to the edge. Now, when you get to the curve that we just stretched out, you can get even closer, you know, like really like 1/8. Like that. Because the further down you go, the more tension you're creating, or the more tension there is. And if you're trying to baste that down, that tension is going to have negative effect on the rest. So here you can see it's very difficult to turn this in, but it is possible, just about. You can't hold this perfectly straight, so you just need to hold this in this. You see, it just wants to curve like that. This is going to be practical. You can still put this in an arm hold, and it will look good, but you just have to be careful when you're folding this. Okay. And then transition into the top sleeve. And here you will not have an issue with tightness, because this is a convex line. You're going to have, well, not issues, but you're going to feel surplus, because a convex line folding back on itself along the convex line will create surplus, as I will demonstrate to you in 1 second. And that's that. Then what we have to do, I mean, you can see there's surplus. Then what we have to do is very easy, just press this flat so that when you're working you don't have all this surplus, first of all, but you also just have it just basted down without any movement. All I'm doing now is I'm just creasing this line that I basted. And try not to crease anything, just, you know, compress it if you can, which is possible because this area is on the bias. Just very gently and if it has to crease, well then it has to crease, but try not to crease a lot. And what I do here usually, it's best to do this on the sleeve board. Take the narrow part, just place this on the edge, try not to stretch it, and then crease just the edge, because if you try to do it flat you're going to create, I mean, there is a lot of tension there, so it's not really going to be possible. Just have to be very careful with the iron. Position it so that there is as little tension and pressure as possible. Sometimes you may compress that little surplus that presents itself, and you are done, my friend. So that is one way, basted. So now it may feel as if you don't have any inlay. You can baste this, and that's that. But you can also do it this way, and it's pretty much the same, exactly the same, I would say. The only difference is that this is basted down and this isn't. It's up to you. Try, I would say, do both of them, and then once you're putting the sleeve in, assess which one is easier. Now, you will always have a handicap, because if you're right-handed you will find it easy to put the left sleeve in, and if you're left-handed you will find it a lot easier to put the right sleeve in. Now, don't do one of these. For example, if you do this on your right sleeve and then you're right-handed and you're really struggling, don't blame it on the fact that this is not folded down or that this is folded down. Also be considerate that you're working on the sleeve that is more difficult for you to put in. So having said that, let's continue and work our way towards the canvassing stages.